We're so glad to have you here. Tonight we will explore profound teachings drawn from ancient wisdom of Zen masters, lessons passed down in quiet temples and mountain retreats. If you'd like, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. I'll be sharing a hand-picked selection of Zen stories, each one a doorway into a deeper understanding of the mind, each one shaped to guide you gently away from tension, overwhelm, and restless thought. These aren't just tales, they're tools, ancient and enduring, that can change the way you experience discomfort, confusion, and the persistent longing for something different. They remind us of what the old teachers knew well, that clarity doesn't come from solving the puzzle of life, but from stepping outside of it. As Dogen once said, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. As you listen, you may begin to feel something shift. Thoughts may soften, the noise within may begin to fade, and a quiet understanding may begin to rise. Let it. It's what you came here for. So settle in. Let yourself fully arrive. Take one slow breath with me, and as you exhale, open yourself to the teachings that have patiently waited, not to be understood by the mind, but to be remembered by something deeper. Let us now explore a story about the profound nature of silence and the wisdom that emerges when we quiet the restless mind. In ancient Japan, a young and ambitious student approached his master, the renowned Zen teacher, Bankei. The student's eyes burned with intellectual fervor, his mind racing with questions and doubts that had plagued him for months. "Master," he said, bowing deeply but with visible agitation, "I have heard the famous koan about the sound of one hand clapping. I have meditated on it tirelessly, analyzed it from every angle, yet enlightenment continues to elude me. I fear I am wandering down the wrong path entirely." Bankei observed his student with eyes that held the depth of still water. He neither hurried to respond nor showed any trace of impatience. Instead, he slowly turned his gaze toward a single reed growing by the edge of a mirror-like pond that reflected the afternoon sky. The reed stood tall and slender, swaying almost imperceptibly in the gentle breeze. "Forget the hand," Bankei said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of practice. "Go and sit by that reed. Do not leave that spot until you can hear the sound of its growing." The student felt a wave of confusion wash over him. How could a reed, which grew in complete silence, produce any sound at all? How could he hear what was not there to be heard? Nevertheless, his respect for his master ran deep, and he obeyed without further question. For days, he sat in unwavering meditation beside the reed, his frustration mounting like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He listened with desperate intensity to every sound the wind whispered through the leaves, every gentle lap of water against the shore, every buzz and hum of insects dancing in the air. Yet the reed remained stubbornly silent, offering no revelation, no mystical sound to unlock the mysteries he sought. His mind raced through philosophical arguments and complex interpretations, grasping at intellectual explanations like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. But as the days wore on, something began to shift. One quiet afternoon, weary from the exhausting effort of trying to force understanding, he simply let go. He released his desperate desire to hear anything at all and allowed himself to just be present with the reed, feeling the warmth of sunlight on his shoulders, the coolness of the breeze on his face. In that moment of profound stillness, when all striving ceased, a deep sense of peace washed over him like gentle waves. He became one with the reed, the pond, the sky, and the very air itself. When he finally returned to Bankai, his demeanor had transformed completely. Gone was the anxious seeker, replaced by someone who carried stillness within himself. "Master," he said, with a bow that emanated genuine reverence, "I have listened." Bankai smiled, recognizing immediately the quality of silence that now surrounded his student. "And what did you hear?" "I heard the silence from which all sounds are born," the student replied, his voice carrying new depth. "The sound of one hand was never the true teaching. The real lesson was to stop the endless clapping of my own mind." Buddha's wisdom reminds us, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the difference between the noise of seeking and the silence of finding. We live in a world that has trained us to believe that answers come through more thinking, more analysis, more mental effort. Yet Zen reveals the opposite truth. The deepest wisdom emerges not from the accumulation of thoughts, but from their gentle cessation. Why do we struggle so profoundly with inner silence? Zen Buddhism points to the restless nature of what is called monkey mind, the chattering, jumping, never settling quality of ordinary consciousness. This mental activity feels productive because it gives us the illusion of progress, the sense that we are working toward understanding. But this very effort often becomes the obstacle to the peace we seek. Consider how often throughout your day your mind resembles that young student's frantic searching. When facing a difficult decision, do you find yourself endlessly weighing options, analyzing possibilities, seeking more information? When experiencing emotional pain, does your mind immediately begin constructing elaborate explanations, assigning blame, or devising strategies for avoidance? This mental churning, while sometimes necessary for practical matters, often drowns out the subtle voice of intuitive wisdom that whispers beneath the noise. Zen Master Huangpo taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." The reed's teaching isn't heard through thinking about growing. It's perceived through intimate presence with the mystery of growth itself. This points to a fundamental distinction in Zen between conceptual understanding and direct experience. The sound of the reeds growing represents all the subtle wisdom available to us in each moment when we're not lost in the commentary of our thoughts. It might be the intuitive sense of what our body needs for healing, the wordless knowing of how to respond to a loved one's pain, or the creative insight that emerges when we stop forcing solutions. These forms of wisdom speak in frequencies too delicate for the noisy mind to detect. In Japanese aesthetics, there exists a concept called mu, the pregnant emptiness that contains infinite possibility, the space between thoughts, the pause between words, the silence between musical notes. This is where the reed sound lives, not in the realm of audible vibration, but in the spacious awareness that perceives growth itself as a sacred process. Zen practice cultivates this quality of receptive listening. Through meditation, we train ourselves to notice when we're caught in the endless clapping of mental commentary and gently return to simple presence. This isn't about suppressing thoughts or forcing silence, but about developing the capacity to rest in the spaces between thoughts, where deeper knowing naturally resides. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of this moment, can you listen for the sound of your own growing? Perhaps it's the gentle expansion of your breath, the the subtle wisdom arising about a relationship in your life, or simply the profound mystery of being alive and aware. As the Buddha taught, silence is an empty space. Space is the home of the awakened mind. In cultivating this inner stillness, we discover that the wisdom we seek has been speaking to us all along through the gentle voice of presence itself. Our next story takes us to a mountain temple where a profound lesson about true value unfolds through an act that appears destructive but reveals the deepest compassion. Daigu was a Zen master who embodied simplicity in every aspect of his life. His small mountain temple contained only the most essential items: a few meditation cushions, basic cooking utensils, and simple robes worn thin from years of use. The governor of the province, a man of wealth and sincere devotion to Buddhist teachings, had long admired Daigu's wisdom and often attempted to express his reverence through gifts of fine silks, expensive incense, and rare delicacies. Each offering was received with gratitude but politely declined, as Daigu gently explained that such luxuries would only burden his simple practice. One autumn day, the governor arrived at the temple personally, his hands carefully cradling a beautifully lacquered box that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. His eyes shone with particular pleasure as he approached the master. "Venerable Daigu," he said, bowing deeply, "I understand completely your reluctance to accept personal luxuries, and I deeply respect your commitment to simplicity. But what I bring today is not for you. It is a gift for the Buddha himself. This is an exquisitely carved statue of the most precious jade created by the finest artisans in the land. Please accept this offering for the temple's altar so that all who come here may witness the beauty of devotion made manifest." Daigu observed the governor's sincere face and genuine desire to honor the Buddha. The man's devotion was unmistakable, his generosity flowing from a pure heart. After a moment of quiet contemplation, Daigu accepted the statue with appropriate ceremony. Together, they placed the luminous jade Buddha on the simple wooden altar, where it seemed to glow with inner light. The governor left that day filled with joy, feeling that he had contributed something meaningful to the sacred space that had given him so much wisdom. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the fiercest snowstorms the mountain had seen in decades. The temple's modest supply of firewood, carefully gathered throughout the autumn, dwindled rapidly as the cold deepened. Soon, the monks found themselves shivering through their meditation sessions, unable to prepare warm meals or maintain the basic comfort necessary for their practice. One morning, as frost covered even the interior walls of the temple, a young monk entered the main hall to tend to the altar and discovered a scene that stopped him in his tracks. Daigu sat peacefully beside the hearth, carefully placing the precious jade Buddha into the flames and kindling a fire around it. The statue began to emit a warm glow as the fire took hold, casting dancing shadows on the master's serene face. The young monk felt his heart leap into his throat. "Master!" he cried out, his voice cracking with horror and disbelief. "What are you doing? That statue is priceless. It was a gift of deep devotion. It represents the Buddha himself." Daigu looked up from the growing warmth of the fire, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor and profound understanding. "Indeed, my young friend," he said, settling back into comfortable meditation posture as heat began to fill the cold room. We are burning the Buddha to keep the Buddha warm. As the Buddha observed, do not believe in anything simply because you have heard it. Do not believe in anything simply because it is spoken and rumored by many. This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound teaching hidden within Daigu's seemingly shocking act. He was demonstrating the difference between form and essence, between symbol and reality. Why do we become so attached to the external representations of spiritual truth? Zen Buddhism reveals several layers to this very human tendency. First is our natural inclination to mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. We invest sacred objects, rituals, and symbols with such reverence that we forget they are merely vessels designed to carry us toward direct experience of the divine. Second is what Buddhist psychology calls form clinging. Our tendency to grasp onto the appearance of things rather than their deeper nature. The jade statue was undeniably beautiful and valuable, but its true worth lay not in its material composition or artistic craftsmanship, but in its capacity to inspire devotion and point hearts toward awakening. When that function could be served more immediately by providing warmth for actual living beings engaged in spiritual practice, the form became expendable. Consider how often in your own life you might prioritize preserving the form of something over serving its essential purpose. Do you ever find yourself more concerned with maintaining the appearance of a relationship than nurturing its genuine intimacy? More invested in preserving religious or spiritual traditions than embodying their transformative wisdom? More attached to the way things should look than responding to what life actually requires in this moment? Zen teacher Yunmen once said, "Every day is a good day." This wasn't naive optimism, but recognition that each moment offers opportunities to express our deepest values, regardless of external circumstances. Daigu's action revealed this principle in dramatic fashion. The good day wasn't defined by having enough firewood or preserving precious objects, but by the willingness to respond with wisdom and compassion to whatever conditions arose. The deeper teaching here shows us that true reverence for the Buddha lies not in worshipping representations of him, but in embodying his compassion in our daily actions. The Buddha himself taught that attachment to material forms, even sacred ones, can become obstacles to awakening. By burning the statue to provide warmth, Daigu was demonstrating Buddha nature in action. The spontaneous expression of wisdom and care that responds to immediate need without hesitation. This story challenges our conventional understanding of what constitutes appropriate spiritual behavior. We're conditioned to think that preserving beautiful, expensive, or historically significant objects shows proper respect. But Zen reveals a more radical perspective. The highest honor we can pay to any spiritual symbol is to embody the qualities it represents, even if that means releasing our attachment to the symbol itself. Look deeply at your own relationship with spiritual forms, whether they be texts, images, practices, or traditions. Can you appreciate their beauty and function while holding them lightly enough to let them go when wisdom calls for something different? Can you distinguish between honoring the essence of what they point toward and clinging to their particular manifestations? Tonight, as you consider what truly deserves your reverence and protection, remember Daigu's radical act of love. What forms might you be holding onto that no longer serve their essential purpose? What would it mean to burn your jade Buddhas in service of keeping the living Buddha of your own awakened heart warm and vibrant? Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Believe nothing, no matter where you read it or who said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense." True spiritual maturity lies not in rigid adherence to external forms, but in the flexible wisdom that can honor essence while releasing attachment to appearance. Let us continue our journey with a tale that reveals how we often carry burdens long after the need for carrying them has passed. Two monks, one senior with many years of practice behind him, and one junior still learning the subtleties of monastic life, were walking together on a pilgrimage through the countryside. Their destination lay many miles ahead, and they walked in the comfortable silence that often develops between companions who share a spiritual path. The rhythm of their footsteps on the dusty road created a meditative cadence that matched their breathing and helped maintain a state of mindful awareness as they traveled. As they approached a wide river where the spring rains had created muddy banks and swift-moving currents, they noticed a young woman standing hesitantly at the water's edge. She wore an elegant silk kimono of deep blue with intricate patterns that clearly marked her as someone of wealth and status. Her delicate silk slippers and the pristine condition of her clothing suggested she was unaccustomed to the rough conditions of country travel. She stood frozen with uncertainty, clearly wanting to cross, but afraid of ruining her expensive garments in the muddy water. Without a moment's hesitation or consultation, the senior monk approached the woman with a gentle bow. "May I assist you across the river?" he asked simply. Before she could fully respond, he had already positioned himself and, with practiced efficiency, hoisted her onto his back. He carried her steadily across the rushing water, his feet finding secure footing despite the slippery stones beneath the surface. Upon reaching the other side, he set her down gently on solid ground with the same matter-of-fact grace with which he had lifted her. The woman straightened her kimono and gave a curt nod of acknowledgement, but no word of thanks passed her lips. Without meeting either monk's eyes, she hurried away down the path, apparently eager to put the encounter behind her and continue with her journey. The two monks watched her disappear around a bend in the road, then resumed their own pilgrimage in silence. But the junior monk's silence was of an entirely different quality than before. Where previously there had been peaceful awareness, now there was a churning mixture of shock, confusion, and growing indignation. How could his respected teacher, a man who had taken sacred vows, including commitments to celibacy and non-attachment, have touched a woman so intimately? How could he have interacted so freely with someone who showed such obvious ingratitude? These questions burned in the younger monk's mind as he walked, creating an internal storm that grew more turbulent with each passing mile. For 2 full hours, he carried these thoughts, turning them over and examining them from every angle, feeding his sense of righteous confusion. The weight of his mental burden grew heavier with each step until finally, unable to contain himself any longer, he burst out with barely controlled emotion. "Brother, why did you do that? You know perfectly well that we are not supposed to touch women under any circumstances. Our vows are clear about maintaining proper boundaries. And that woman, she was so ungrateful. She didn't even thank you for your kindness." The senior monk turned to look at his companion with eyes that held gentle amusement rather than defensiveness. A serene smile spread across his weathered face as he replied, "My friend, I left that woman by the river 2 hours ago. Are you still carrying her?" Buddha's wisdom reminds us, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. Here we discover the profound difference between necessary action and unnecessary suffering, between responding to what life presents and carrying psychological burdens that serve no purpose. Why do we so readily pick up these invisible weights and carry them for hours, days, or even years? Buddhist psychology identifies several mental habits that create this pattern. The first is our tendency toward rumination, the mind's compulsive habit of chewing endlessly on experiences, particularly those that trigger strong emotional reactions. Like a dog with a bone, we gnaw at disturbing events, examining them from every angle. But this mental activity rarely leads to resolution or peace. The second factor is our attachment to being right about our judgments. The junior monk wasn't just confused by his teacher's behavior, he was invested in his interpretation of what appropriate conduct should look like. When reality didn't match his expectations, instead of questioning his assumptions, he carried the conflict internally, allowing it to poison his experience for hours. The third element is what Zen calls sticky mind. Consciousness that adheres to whatever it encounters instead of letting experiences arise and pass naturally. Like walking through a spider web, we collect psychological debris as we move through our days, accumulating resentments, worries, and preoccupations that have nothing to do with our present moment reality. Consider how often throughout your day you find yourself carrying people or situations long after your actual interaction with them has ended. The coworker who didn't return your greeting this morning. Are you still puzzling over their apparent rudeness at lunchtime? The driver who cut you off in traffic. Does their inconsiderate behavior continue to irritate you hours later? The friend who made an insensitive comment last week. Do you find yourself rehearsing better responses you wish you had given? Zen Master Suzuki Roshi taught, each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement. This gentle paradox applies perfectly to our relationship with carrying psychological burdens. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with having emotional reactions to life events. This is part of being human. The opportunity for improvement lies in learning to put down these reactions when they no longer serve us. The senior monk's wisdom wasn't in avoiding contact with the woman or suppressing natural human responsiveness. His wisdom lay in his ability to act from compassion when action was needed, then release the entire interaction completely when it was finished. He didn't carry the woman physically beyond the river, and he didn't carry her psychologically either. This points to a crucial distinction in Zen practice between engagement and attachment. We can be fully present and responsive to whatever situation arises without becoming psychologically stuck to the outcomes or other people's reactions. The senior monk helped the woman not because he expected gratitude, but because helping was the natural expression of compassion in that moment. Her response, whether grateful or dismissive, had no bearing on the appropriateness of his action. Look deeply at what you might be carrying right now that you could simply set down. What old conversations are you still rehearsing? What past hurts are you keeping alive through repetitive thinking? What future scenarios are you mentally preparing for that may never materialize? These psychological burdens are like invisible passengers we carry on our backs, weighing down our steps and obscuring our ability to be present to what's actually happening now. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, can you practice the senior monk's wisdom? Can you review the day and consciously set down any people situations, or emotions you've been carrying unnecessarily? Can you leave at the river's edge anything that no longer requires your attention? As the Buddha taught, you only lose what you cling to. The path to freedom isn't found in avoiding life's challenges, but in learning to meet them fully and then release them completely, carrying forward only the wisdom they've offered, not the weight of their memory. Now let us turn to a story about the profound difference between receiving what others offer and accepting what we choose to take into ourselves. In ancient Japan, a famously hot-tempered young samurai sought out an old Zen master who was renowned throughout the region for his unshakable peace and wisdom. The samurai had heard tales of this teacher's ability to remain calm in any situation, and his own volatile nature had caused him so much suffering that he was desperate to learn the secret of such inner stability. The master agreed to teach him, but the first week brought nothing like what the samurai had expected. Instead of profound philosophical discussions or advanced meditation techniques, he found himself assigned to menial tasks around the temple. Each morning, he chopped wood for the cooking fires, carried heavy buckets of water from the well, and swept the temple floors with meticulous care. Day after day, his frustration mounted as he performed these humble chores, while the master seemed to pay him little attention. By the end of the week, the samurai's legendary temper had reached its breaking point. He stormed into the master's simple quarters, where the old man sat peacefully sipping tea, apparently oblivious to his student's growing agitation. "This is intolerable!" the samurai shouted, his face flushed with rage. "I came here to learn wisdom, not to be your personal servant. You are nothing but a fraud who preys on the desperation of seekers." The old master continued sipping his tea with the same serene expression he had worn all week, showing no reaction whatsoever to the verbal assault. This complete lack of response only inflamed the samurai further. He began hurling increasingly harsh insults, calling the master a charlatan, a lazy old fool, and worse. Still, the teacher's face remained as peaceful as a still pond, unmarked by even the slightest ripple of disturbance. In a final explosion of fury, the samurai grabbed a handful of gravel from the garden path and hurled it directly at the master. The small stones struck the old man's robes and scattered harmlessly to the floor around his meditation cushion. Not once did the master flinch or show any sign that he had even noticed the physical attack. When the samurai's rage had finally exhausted itself, the master set down his teacup and looked at him with eyes that held no trace of anger or judgment. "Tell me," he said in a voice as calm as morning mist, "if someone offers you a gift and you choose not to accept it, to whom does that gift belong?" The samurai, caught off guard by the question and still breathing heavily from his outburst, stammered, To the one who offered it, I suppose." "Exactly," said the master with a gentle nod. "I do not accept your anger, your insults, or your violence. They remain entirely yours." He then pointed to a large, smooth river stone that sat near the temple steps, polished by countless years of wind and water. "Your mind can learn to be like that stone. The fiercest winds can howl around it. The heaviest rains can beat upon it. The most scorching sun can bake it throughout the day. Yet the stone remains unchanged, not because it is unfeeling or unaware, but simply because it rests in its own true nature, unmoved by the constantly changing weather that surrounds it." The master's voice took on an even gentler quality as he continued. "Your anger, your frustration, your need to lash out, These are simply weather patterns moving through your inner landscape. They are not who you are, any more than a thunderstorm is the essential nature of the sky. You can learn to observe these emotional storms without being swept away by them, to let them pass through your awareness without allowing them to disturb your fundamental peace. The samurai stood in stunned silence, feeling the heat of his rage suddenly cooled by the profound stillness that emanated from his teacher. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what true strength looked like. Not the ability to overpower others through force or intimidation, but the capacity to remain unshakable in one's own center, regardless of external circumstances. He bowed deeply, finally ready to begin the real learning he had come to find. The Buddha once said, "You will not be punished for your anger. You will be punished by your anger." What emerges from this story is the revolutionary understanding that we have complete choice over what we allow into our internal experience, regardless of what others may offer us through their words or actions. Why do we so automatically accept the emotional gifts that others thrust upon us? Zen Buddhism points to several deeply conditioned patterns that make us vulnerable to taking on others' anger, criticism, or negativity. The first is our identification with the ego self that feels compelled to defend itself against any perceived attack. When someone offers us the gift of their anger, our defensive mechanisms kick in automatically, and we accept their offering by generating our own anger in response. The second factor is what Buddhist psychology calls emotional contagion, our tendency to unconsciously mirror the emotional states of those around us. Just as we might catch a cold from someone who sneezes near us, we often catch emotional states from people who express them in our presence. But unlike physical contagion, emotional contagion requires our participation, though this participation usually happens below the level of conscious awareness. Consider how often throughout your day you find yourself accepting gifts you never asked for. When a frustrated colleague snaps at you, do you automatically accept their irritation and make it your own? When someone criticizes your work, do you take their judgment inside yourself and begin to doubt your abilities? When a family member expresses disappointment in your choices, do you accept their disappointment as evidence that you should feel guilty? Zen teacher Byron Katie teaches, defense is the first act of war. Every time we accept someone else's emotional offering and respond defensively, we enter into a kind of psychological warfare that can escalate indefinitely. The master in our story demonstrates a completely different approach, the radical refusal to participate in emotional exchanges that serve no constructive purpose. This doesn't mean becoming cold, unfeeling, or disconnected from others. The stone in the story isn't depicted as frozen or dead, but as naturally stable, resting in its essential nature while remaining fully present to its environment. Similarly, we can develop the capacity to remain centered and responsive without automatically absorbing and reflecting back every emotional energy directed toward us. The deeper teaching here shows us that true strength lies not in our ability to defend ourselves against others' negativity, but in our capacity to remain grounded in our own inner peace regardless of external turbulence. This requires developing what Zen calls don't know mind, the willingness to question our automatic assumptions about what others' behavior means about us or requires from us. Look deeply at your own patterns of accepting unwanted gifts. What emotional offerings do you find most difficult to refuse? Criticism, anger, anxiety, guilt, drama. Can you begin to recognize the moment when someone extends these gifts toward you? And can you practice the radical freedom of simply not taking them? Zen Master Dogen wrote, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." Part of forgetting the self involves releasing our compulsive need to take everything personally, to defend our positions, or to prove our worth through emotional reactivity. When we're securely grounded in our own essential nature, we can respond to others from wisdom rather than from wounded pride. Tonight, as you reflect on the interactions you had today, can you identify any emotional gifts you accepted that you could have politely declined? Can you practice being like the stone, present, aware, and responsive, but fundamentally unmoved by the passing weather of others' emotional storms? As the Buddha taught, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. When we refuse to accept others' anger and respond instead from our own center of peace, we offer them something far more valuable than the reflection of their own turbulence. We offer them the gift of experiencing what serenity looks like in the face of storm. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a teaching that addresses one of the most challenging aspects of human existence: our relationship with change and impermanence. A sincere disciple approached his master with a question that had been troubling his heart for many months. His face carried the weight of someone wrestling with profound spiritual confusion, and his words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. "Master," he began, bowing with deep respect, "you speak constantly of impermanence, teaching that everything in existence is in constant flux, that nothing remains the same from one moment to the next. I have studied this concept extensively, analyzed it from every philosophical angle, and I believe I understand it intellectually. Yet, my heart simply cannot accept this truth. Every morning I wake to see the same mountain rising majestically outside my window, its peaks unchanged since my childhood. I drink from the same well that my grandfather dug, drawing water that tastes exactly as it did when I was young. Each night, I gaze upon the same moon that has watched over humanity for countless generations. If everything is truly changing as you teach, why does my daily experience seem to contradict this fundamental principle?" The master listened with the patient attention of someone who had encountered this question many times before, recognizing in his student's words the eternal human struggle between intellectual understanding and lived experience. Without speaking, he gestured for the disciple to follow him. They walked together in contemplative silence until they reached the banks of a river that flowed nearby the monastery, its waters catching the late afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. "Look carefully at this river," the master said, settling himself comfortably on a large boulder near the water's edge. "Tell me what you observe." The disciple studied the flowing water, noting its steady current, the way it curved around rocks, the consistent sound it made as it moved toward the distant sea. "I see a river, master. It flows steadily from the mountains toward the ocean, just as it has for countless years." "Good," the master replied. "Now, dip your hand into the water and feel its coolness." The disciple knelt and immersed his hand in the flowing stream, feeling the gentle current playing around his fingers and the surprisingly cool temperature that contrasted with the warmth of the afternoon air. "Now," the master continued, "remove your hand and dip it into the river again." The disciple lifted his hand from the water, observed it for a moment, then lowered it once more into the stream. "Tell me," the master asked with eyes that sparkled with gentle humor, "is this the same river you touched the first time?" The disciple responded immediately, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "Of course it is the same river, master. It is the same body of water flowing in the same direction through the same landscape." The master shook his head slowly, his expression becoming more serious as he prepared to reveal the deeper teaching. "The water your hand first touched has already traveled far downstream, perhaps reaching the valley below, or even beginning its journey to the sea. Entirely new water has taken its place where your hand now rests. The molecules surrounding your fingers are completely different from those you first encountered. You are not the same person who first dipped his hand into this stream. Moments have passed. Millions of cells in your body have been replaced. Countless new thoughts and perceptions have arisen and dissolved in your consciousness. You see the form of the river, just as you see the form of the mountain and the moon. But the substance is never identical from one moment to the next." The master's voice took on the quality of flowing water itself as he continued. "You are trying to hold on to the river that has already flowed far beyond your reach. You are clinging to a mountain whose rocks are constantly weathering grain by grain, to a moon whose face changes nightly as it waxes and wanes, to a well whose water comes from ever-changing underground springs. The forms appear stable because the changes happen too slowly for ordinary perception to detect, or too quickly for the mind to track. But make no mistake, everything you think of as permanent is actually a flowing process, including the very consciousness that observes and seeks to understand." The disciple sat in profound silence beside the flowing water, and for the first time in his spiritual seeking, he felt the truth of impermanence not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a living reality that encompassed every aspect of his existence. He watched the ceaseless flow of the river with new eyes, seeing in it a perfect metaphor for the constantly changing nature of all phenomena, including his own sense of being a fixed and separate self. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Nothing is permanent except change." This teaching reveals one of the most fundamental insights of Buddhist wisdom, that our suffering often stems from our resistance to the natural flow of existence, our attempt to make permanent what is inherently fluid. Why do we find impermanence so difficult to accept, even when we understand it intellectually? Zen Buddhism identifies several psychological mechanisms that create this resistance. First is our evolutionary conditioning for pattern recognition and stability. Our survival as a species has depended on our ability to identify reliable sources of food, shelter, and safety. This deep programming makes us naturally seek permanence and predictability, even in areas where such stability is ultimately impossible. Second is what Buddhist psychology calls self-clinging, our unconscious assumption that there is a fixed, unchanging self at the center of our experience. This sense of being a solid, continuous entity makes it difficult to truly comprehend that everything else might be in constant flux. If I am permanent, the reasoning goes, then surely the world around me must have permanent features as well. Third is our tendency to confuse conceptual labels with actual reality. We create mental categories like river, mountain, and moon, then assume these labels refer to static objects rather than dynamic processes. Language itself reinforces this illusion by using nouns to describe what are actually ongoing verbs. There is no river, only rivering, no mountain, only mountaining. Consider how this insight might transform your relationship with areas of life where you experience resistance or suffering. Are you holding on to a relationship that has fundamentally changed, trying to make it conform to what it once was? Are you clinging to an identity or role that no longer fits who you are becoming? Are you resisting aging, career transitions, or changes in your physical or mental capabilities? Zen Master Dogen taught, "Time is not separate from you, and as you are present, time does not go away." This points to a profound shift in perspective. Instead of seeing ourselves as fixed beings moving through changing circumstances, we can recognize ourselves as part of the very flow of change itself. We are not separate from the river of time. We are expressions of it. The deeper teaching here shows us that accepting impermanence isn't about resignation or pessimism, but about aligning ourselves with the fundamental nature of reality. When we stop fighting the current, we can begin to dance with it. When we release our grip on how things should remain, we become available to appreciate how they actually are in each moment. Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, impermanence is not something to be afraid of. It's the very basis of life. Without change, there would be no growth, no healing, no learning, no possibility for transformation. The same impermanence that takes away what we cherish also brings new opportunities, fresh perspectives, and unexpected gifts. Look deeply at your own relationship with change in this moment. What are you trying to hold on to that is already flowing away from you? What are you resisting that might be trying to emerge in your life? Can you feel yourself as part of the river, rather than someone standing on its banks trying to control its flow? Tonight, as you observe the rise and fall of your breath, the coming and going of thoughts, the subtle changes in how your body feels as you settle into rest, can you practice meeting impermanence as a friend rather than an enemy? Can you let yourself flow with the constant renewal that is your birthright as a conscious being? As the Buddha taught, of all footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Similarly, of all mindfulness meditations, that on death is supreme. By truly accepting the impermanent nature of all phenomena, including our own precious lives, we discover the freedom to love fully, act courageously, and appreciate deeply whatever is present in this irreplaceable moment. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the interplay between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, contemplative man who seemed to understand something profound about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky gorge below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging torrent and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who witnessed his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in anguish as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man emerging from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had witnessed. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I accommodated myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself, and this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a fortunate accident. They had seen a demonstration of a profound principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents, rather than exhausting ourselves in futile resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will. But this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Consider your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach, not passive submission, but conscious adaptation that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through accommodation rather than force. Zen master Lao Tzu taught, water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock, which cannot yield and is destroyed. The old man embodied this teaching, demonstrating that apparent weakness can be a source of tremendous strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to accommodate yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change, discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. Let us continue on our journey with a story about discovering the source of true freedom. This is the tale of the student and the master's heart. In a peaceful monastery garden where cherry blossoms drifted like snow, a young student approached his teacher during evening meditation. The master sat beneath an ancient maple tree, twilight painting the sky in soft purples and golds. This student had been practicing earnestly for years, yet lately questions had been arising that reached deeper than formal instruction. Taking a seat beside his teacher, the student gathered courage to voice what had been troubling him. "Master," he began quietly, "when I was young, I had a deep desire for my family and loved ones to be proud of me. I wanted to excel in studies, to accomplish things that would make them beam with joy. Were you ever the same way?" The master turned his gentle gaze toward the student, seeing in the young man's eyes the same earnest longing that had once driven his own seeking. After contemplative silence, he replied simply, "Yes, I was very much the same." The student felt relief at this admission. "Why did you desire their pride so intensely?" he asked. "What was driving that need for approval?" The master smiled with tender recognition. "I wanted them to feel they had more reason to love and accept me," he said thoughtfully. "If I could make them proud, surely their love would be secure and abundant. But the reason I desired this went even deeper." The student leaned closer, sensing they were approaching something essential. "I sought their love so desperately," the master continued, "because I, in turn, would feel I had sufficient reason to love and accept myself. I was seeking permission from others to feel good about who I was. Their approval would be evidence of my worthiness even to myself. That was what lay at the root of all my striving." The master paused, watching the first stars appear. "But then one day, I awakened to a revolutionary possibility. I realized I could ask myself a different question. What if I could bypass all external validation and simply learn to love and accept myself unconditionally? What if I didn't require anyone else's approval to feel genuinely good about my existence? The student felt something shift in his chest as these words settled. I imagined what it would be like if my happiness no longer depended on outer circumstances, on whether people approved or disapproved of my choices. What if my sense of worth could be as constant as my own heartbeat, independent of any external validation? The student could feel his teacher's words pointing toward a freedom he had never considered. And that realization began your quest for self-realization? Exactly, the master nodded. That was when my true spiritual journey began, not with seeking something outside myself, but with discovering what was already complete within. After contemplative silence, the student asked, "And did you never again desire their pride? Did that longing completely disappear?" The master chuckled softly. "Oh, my ego certainly continued to desire approval. Conditioned patterns don't vanish overnight, but something fundamental had shifted in my relationship to those desires. I no longer completely identified with my ego as I had before." He gestured toward the darkening garden, where fireflies had begun their dance. I learned to see those approval-seeking thoughts as passing phenomena, like these fireflies appearing and disappearing. I could observe them with interest and compassion, but I no longer gave them power to determine my worth. "So you still cared what others thought?" the student asked. "I respected their opinions and honored their perspectives," the master replied. "But I no longer gave them so much weight. Their approval became like weather, sometimes pleasant, sometimes not, but no longer the determining factor in whether I felt at peace with myself." The master's face radiated quiet joy, and never had I felt so free as when I finally released myself in this way. It was like discovering I had been carrying invisible chains for decades, and suddenly they fell away. The love I had been seeking outside was revealed to have been within me all along. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, if you truly loved yourself, you would never hurt yourself with destructive thoughts, actions, or choices. This teaching points to the heart of the master's discovery. Most suffering stems from the mistaken belief that we must earn the right to love ourselves through external achievements or approval. Here, we discover one of the most revolutionary insights available. Self-love is not a reward to be earned, but our natural birthright to be claimed. We are born complete and worthy, not because of what we accomplish, but simply because we exist. Why do we find unconditional self-love so difficult? From childhood, we absorb messages suggesting love must be earned through good behavior, achievement, or pleasing others. We learn to treat ourselves the way we were treated, often with criticism and conditions. These patterns become so familiar that unconditional self-acceptance feels foreign. Our culture intensifies this conditioning by promoting the myth that happiness comes from external sources. Each message reinforces the delusion that we are incomplete as we are. Consider how much mental energy goes toward managing others' opinions. How often do you modify authentic expression to gain approval? How much self-worth depends on external feedback rather than internal recognition of inherent value? When we love ourselves unconditionally, we create a foundation of fulfillment that allows us to enjoy others' affection without depending on it. We can receive compliments with gratitude rather than desperate hunger, and handle criticism without devastation, because our core worth remains untouched. The Buddha said, "You can search throughout the entire universe for someone more deserving of your love and affection, than you are yourself, and that person is not to be found anywhere. You, yourself, deserve your love and affection. This isn't narcissism. It's recognition of fundamental truth about consciousness itself. Tonight, as you rest in this moment's quiet, can you sense the presence that is reading these words? This awareness that knows your thoughts and witnesses your experiences is not improved or diminished by anything that happens. It remains constant and clear, like space itself. What would it be like to treat this aware presence with the tenderness it deserves? Perhaps you could offer yourself the same patience you'd give a beloved child learning, or the same compassion you'd feel for a friend in difficulties. As the Buddha taught, hatred is never appeased by hatred. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. Self-criticism is never healed by more self-criticism. Only by learning to love ourselves exactly as we are do we create inner conditions for authentic transformation. In discovering this unconditional love within, we find the freedom we sought through others' approval was always here, beating steadily in our own hearts. Let us continue on our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism with a story about the phantoms we create with our own minds. This is the tale of the haunting that was no haunting at all. A man lived peacefully with his beloved wife for many years, their love deep and genuine, their companionship a source of daily joy. But as fate would have it, she became gravely ill. As she lay on her deathbed, her breathing shallow and her strength fading, she grasped her husband's hand with surprising force. "My darling," she whispered, her eyes filled with both love and fear. "I cannot bear the thought of leaving you, and I cannot bear the thought of you loving another. Promise me that when I am gone, you will not see any other women. Promise me you will remain faithful to my memory forever, or I swear I will return from the grave to haunt you." The husband, his heart breaking at her words and her impending departure, made the promise she demanded. What else could he do? In that moment of grief and love, he would have agreed to anything to ease her suffering and honor their bond. For several months after her death, the widower kept his word. He avoided social gatherings, declined invitations, and turned away from any possibility of female companionship. His world became small and lonely, filled only with work and memories. But as time passed and the sharpest edge of grief began to soften, he found himself drawn back into the world of the living. It was at a local market that he met her, a kind woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile. Despite his promise to his deceased wife, he found himself drawn to this new person. Conversations led to friendship. Friendship deepened into affection. And eventually, despite his guilt and internal conflict, he fell in love again. The night he and his new love became engaged, his worst fears materialized. As he lay in bed, the room suddenly grew cold, and there before him stood the unmistakable figure of his dead wife. Her face was pale with anger, her eyes blazing with accusation. "You have broken your promise to me," she said, her voice carrying the chill of the grave. "You have betrayed our love and dishonored my memory." But what truly terrified the man was not just her appearance. It was her impossible knowledge. Night after night, she would return to torment him, recounting in perfect detail everything that had transpired between him and his fiancée. She would repeat their conversations word for word, describe their private moments, reveal their most intimate exchanges. Nothing remained hidden from this ghostly presence. The haunting became so intense that the man could no longer sleep. Dark circles formed under his eyes. His hands shook constantly, and his new relationship began to suffer under the weight of his terror and exhaustion. Desperate for relief, he sought out a Zen master who lived in a small temple near the village. "Master," the man said, his voice trembling as he recounted his story, "my dead wife's ghost appears to me every night. She knows everything I do, everything I say. She repeats our conversations exactly as they happened. I am being driven to madness." The old master listened carefully, stroking his beard thoughtfully. When the man finished his account, the master smiled knowingly. "This is indeed a very clever ghost," he said. "You should admire such supernatural wisdom. But I will tell you exactly what to do when she appears tonight." That evening, as the room grew cold and the familiar figure materialized, the man followed the master's instructions precisely. "You are truly a wise and all-knowing spirit," he said to the ghost. "You see everything I do and know everything I think. Since you possess such incredible powers and I can hide nothing from you, surely you can answer one simple question for me." "Ask your question," the ghost replied coldly. The man reached down to a large bag of beans that sat near his bedside table. He scooped up a handful and held his closed fist toward the apparition. "Tell me exactly how many beans I am holding in my hand right now." The ghost opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her form began to waver, becoming translucent around the edges. For the first time since her appearances began, she looked uncertain, even confused. I cannot," she stammered, and then, like morning mist touched by sunlight, she simply vanished. The ghost never returned again, and the man was finally free to live his life in peace. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. The deeper teaching here shows us how powerfully our minds can create seemingly real experiences from nothing but guilt, fear, and unresolved emotions. Why do we give such power to the ghosts of our own making? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes not from external forces, but from the phantoms we create through our own psychological patterns. The ghost in this story was nothing more than the man's own guilt and conditioning, projected outward and given form by his tormented mind. Consider how often in your own life you are haunted by voices that seem to know your every move, that judge your every decision, that remind you of promises you've broken or standards you've failed to meet. These internalized critics often speak with the voices of people from our past, parents, teachers, former partners, but their power comes entirely from our own minds giving them substance. The man's ghost could recite his conversations perfectly because it was his own memory playing them back to him. It knew his private moments because it was created by his own consciousness. It appeared when his guilt was strongest because guilt was its very substance. The ghost was real in its effects, but had no independent existence. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between what is actually present and what our minds are adding to the situation. The man was genuinely in love with a new person, but his conditioning told him this was a betrayal. His deceased wife was genuinely gone, but his unprocessed grief and guilt kept her psychologically present. The master's solution was brilliant in its simplicity. By asking the ghost to know something that existed only in the present moment, something the man's own mind couldn't possibly know, he revealed the phantom's true nature. The beans in his hand were unknown even to him until he counted them. No amount of memory, guilt, or psychological projection could provide this information. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck said, "Our thoughts are just thoughts. They're not necessarily true, they're not necessarily important, and they're not necessarily ours." The ghost's accusations felt absolutely real to the man, but they were simply thoughts and emotions given form by his own mental processes. Look deeply at your own experience. What ghosts do you carry that speak with impossible authority about your worth, your choices, your future? Often these voices claim to know things they cannot possibly know. What others really think of you, what will happen if you take risks, whether you deserve happiness or love. The Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think you become. When we understand that we are constantly creating our experience through the stories we tell ourselves, we begin to see that we also have the power to question these stories, to test their validity, to challenge their authority over our lives. Tonight, as you notice the familiar voices of self-doubt, guilt, or fear arising in your mind, can you remember the man and his handful of beans? Can you find the courage to ask these internal critics to prove their supernatural knowledge by answering questions they cannot possibly answer? Can you recognize that the very thoughts that seem to know everything about you actually know far less than they claim? As the Buddha observed, doubt everything, find your own light. The ghosts that haunt us lose their power the moment we stop feeding them with our belief, the moment we see them for what they truly are, not supernatural visitations, but creations of our own minds that can be dissolved as easily as they were formed. Now, let us explore a Zen story about the irreplaceable nature of direct spiritual transmission. This is the tale of Bankei and the messenger. In the bustling capital city, where merchants haggled in crowded marketplaces and scholars debated in tea houses, the renowned Zen master Bankei had completed another period of teaching at one of the great temples. Known throughout the region for his profound insight and ability to point students directly toward their Buddha nature, Bankei maintained a simple practice of traveling between temples, offering instruction wherever sincere students gathered. As the master prepared to depart for his next destination, carefully folding his few possessions into a traveling bundle, a well-dressed gentleman approached him with urgent politeness. The man's fine silk robes and careful manner suggested someone accustomed to moving in aristocratic circles, likely a retainer or aide to one of the noble families that supported the temple. "Venerable master," the gentleman said, bowing deeply, "I come with a request from the Baron, a man of great learning and sincere interest in your teachings. He has heard of your wisdom and wishes desperately to meet with you personally, but urgent matters have detained him today. Would you consider postponing your departure by one day so that he might have the honor of studying with you tomorrow?" Bankei, despite his eagerness to reach the next temple where students awaited him, recognized the genuine need in the request. The path of a teacher required flexibility and compassion, even when inconvenient. "Of course," he replied simply, "I shall remain one more day." The master unpacked his bundle and settled back into the temple quarters, spending the evening in quiet meditation and preparation for what he anticipated would be a meaningful encounter with a sincere seeker. He had met many nobles over the years who approached Zen with genuine humility despite their worldly status, and he looked forward to offering whatever guidance might be helpful. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the sound of temple bells calling the community to meditation. Bankei waited in his designated meeting room as the appointed time approached. But instead of the Baron himself, the same well-dressed gentleman appeared again, this time with obvious embarrassment written across his features. "Master," the man began, his voice heavy with apology, "I bring regrettable news. The Baron was called away on urgent business that could not be delayed, matters of state that demanded his immediate attention. However, he has not forgotten his desire for your teaching. He has asked me to serve as his representative, to receive your instruction on his behalf, and carry your wisdom back to him faithfully." The gentleman paused, clearly hoping this arrangement would prove acceptable. The Baron's specific question concerns the nature of mind itself. He wishes to understand, what is the true nature of consciousness, and how can one realize it directly? If you would share your teaching on this matter, I promise to convey every word exactly as you speak it. Bankei listened to this request with gentle attention, his expression remaining calm and compassionate. When the gentleman finished speaking, the master sat quietly for a moment, as if considering not just the question, but the entire situation, the absent seeker, the well-intentioned messenger, and the profound impossibility of what was being asked. Finally, Bankei spoke with characteristic simplicity and directness. "This matter of Zen is difficult to convey even through direct question and answer, between teacher and student meeting face to face. It becomes all the more difficult, indeed impossible, to transmit through a messenger, no matter how sincere or capable that messenger might be." Having delivered this response, the master said nothing more. He simply sat in silence, embodying the very teaching he had just articulated. The gentleman waited, perhaps expecting elaboration or alternative suggestions, but none came. Eventually, finding himself speechless and somewhat confused, the gentleman bowed politely and withdrew from the temple. The Buddha once said, "Be a lamp unto yourself." This profound truth reveals itself in Bankei's gentle but firm refusal to reduce Zen wisdom to a message that could be carried by proxy. Spiritual awakening cannot be transmitted second-hand because it is not information, but transformation. Why do we often approach spiritual learning as if it were academic knowledge that can be collected and conveyed through intermediaries? Zen Buddhism teaches that awakening is not a concept to be understood, but a reality to be directly experienced. Like the taste of water to someone who is thirsty, it cannot be adequately described. It must be experienced firsthand. The Baron's question about the nature of consciousness reveals our typical approach to spiritual inquiry. We want to understand awareness intellectually, to grasp it conceptually, to possess it as knowledge. But consciousness cannot be made into an object of study because it is the very subject doing the studying. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The seeing itself is what you are trying to see. Consider how often throughout your day you might approach spiritual wisdom as information to be collected, rather than truth to be embodied. We read books about meditation instead of meditating. We study descriptions of enlightenment instead of investigating our present experience. We seek answers about the nature of mind instead of directly examining what we call mind right now. Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." This paradox points to the heart of why spiritual transmission requires direct engagement. The self that wants to understand Buddhism intellectually is the very construction that must be seen through. This seeing through happens not through accumulating knowledge, but through intimate investigation of immediate experience. The messenger in the story represents our own tendency to approach awakening indirectly, We want to understand consciousness from a safe distance, maintaining the illusion that we are separate observers studying an object called awareness. But awareness is what we are, not what we have. It cannot be possessed, understood, or transmitted because we are expressions of it. Bankei's silence after his brief explanation was itself a teaching. In Zen, silence often conveys what words cannot. The gaps between thoughts, the space between breaths, the awareness in which all experiences arise. These cannot be captured in language, but can be directly recognized when we stop trying to grasp them conceptually. This doesn't mean spiritual teaching is impossible or that teachers serve no purpose. Rather, it means that authentic teaching points students toward their own direct experience, rather than providing second-hand descriptions of someone else's realization. The teacher's role is not to deliver enlightenment, but to create conditions where students might recognize what they already are. Tonight, as you experience the simple fact of being conscious, aware of these words, aware of your body, aware of the space in which thoughts and sensations appear, can you investigate this awareness directly rather than through concepts? Can you be present to your experience rather than trying to understand it through someone else's descriptions? As the Buddha taught, work out your own salvation with diligence. The path to freedom cannot be walked by proxy. It requires your own feet, your own breath, your own willingness to look directly at what you have always been but perhaps never clearly seen. Let us continue on our journey with a teaching about the dangerous gap between conceptual understanding and lived experience. This is the story of the one-eyed monk and the silent debate. In ancient China, when traveling monks wandered from monastery to monastery seeking teachings and testing their understanding, a particular custom had developed among Zen communities. Before a wandering monk could receive lodging for the night, he had to engage in what was called Dharma combat, with either the abbot or a designated representative. This wasn't physical fighting, but a contest of spiritual wit and understanding, where profound questions and paradoxical answers revealed the depth of each participant's realization. At one renowned monastery nestled in bamboo forests, a travel-worn monk arrived as evening shadows began to lengthen across the courtyards. His robes were dusty from mountain paths, his straw sandals worn thin, but his eyes carried the alert brightness of someone genuinely seeking deeper understanding. The abbot, busy with evening duties, assigned his personal attendant to conduct the traditional Dharma encounter. This attendant had served the monastery faithfully for many years, though he possessed what others might consider a disadvantage. He had lost one eye in an accident during his youth. Despite this physical limitation, or perhaps because of the clarity it had brought to his inner vision, he had developed profound insight into the Buddha's teachings. When the two monks met in the monastery's formal reception hall, the traveling monk proposed something unusual. "Let us engage in silent debate," he suggested, gesturing with his hands to indicate they would communicate through gestures alone rather than words. Sometimes the deepest truths transcend language altogether. The attendant nodded agreement, and they began their wordless exchange. The wayfarer raised one finger toward the ceiling, holding it steady with an expression of calm confidence. Without hesitation, the attendant responded by raising two fingers. The traveling monk, seeming pleased by this response, then raised 3 fingers. At this, the attendant surprised him by making a tight fist and holding it firmly in the space between them. The traveling monk's confident expression faltered. For a moment, he stared at the clenched fist, his face showing confusion and something approaching alarm. Then, without attempting any further gestures, he bowed quickly and left the hall. Soon afterward, he found the abbot and spoke with obvious respect and disappointment. "Venerable sir, your representative is far too advanced for me. I must continue my journey rather than presume to stay in your monastery tonight." The abbot raised his eyebrows with interest. "Please, tell me what transpired in your exchange." "Well," the traveler explained earnestly, "I began by holding up one finger to symbolize the Buddha, the awakened one who showed us the path to enlightenment. But your monk immediately responded with two fingers, indicating the Buddha and the Dharma, both the teacher and the teachings he offered. So I raised three fingers to represent the complete triple gem, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the community of practitioners. But then he held up a clenched fist to show that all three are actually one unified reality. His understanding is clearly beyond mine, so I must seek instruction elsewhere before I could be worthy of staying here." The abbot listened to this interpretation with growing surprise, for he knew his attendant's character well. As the traveling monk departed into the gathering dusk, the attendant himself appeared, visibly agitated and breathing hard from running. "Where is that insolent rascal?" he demanded, his single eye blazing with indignation. "I've been looking everywhere for him. The nerve of that man! I've never encountered such rudeness disguised as spiritual inquiry." "What exactly happened?" the abbot asked, genuinely curious now about what had transpired between these two very different interpretations of the same event. "First," the attendant explained, his voice rising with remembered offense, "he insulted me by holding up one finger to indicate that I had only one eye. Can you imagine? Here I thought we were engaging in spiritual discourse, but he immediately drew attention to my physical limitation. Determined to remain polite despite such crudeness, I held up two fingers to acknowledge that he was blessed with two eyes. I was trying to show that I bore him no ill will for his thoughtless comment." The attendant paused to catch his breath, his agitation increasing as he continued. But the scoundrel wasn't satisfied with that insult. Next, he held up three fingers to rub it in further, indicating that between the two of us, there were only three eyes total. He was deliberately emphasizing our difference, making sure I couldn't forget my disability. That's when I'd had enough. I made a fist because I was about to hit him for his persistent rudeness. But the coward saw what was coming and ran off before I could teach him proper manners. The abbot stood in stunned silence, contemplating this remarkable demonstration of how two people could participate in identical events while inhabiting completely different realities. The Buddha taught, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." This profound truth reveals itself in the complete misunderstanding between our two monks, each of whom experienced the exact same gestures while living in entirely different interpretations of reality. Why do we so often project our own concerns, insecurities, and assumptions onto neutral situations? Zen Buddhism points to what it calls the 8 worldly winds: praise and blame, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, fame and disgrace. These psychological forces create internal weather systems that color our perception of everything around us. The attendant's sensitivity about his missing eye created a filter through which every gesture became a personal attack. His past experiences of being judged or pitied for his appearance had created such a strong interpretive framework that he couldn't perceive any other possible meaning in the traveler's hand signals. Similarly, the traveling monk's spiritual preoccupations caused him to see profound Dharma teachings in what were actually expressions of wounded feelings and growing anger. His framework of seeking enlightened instruction made him interpret increasingly aggressive gestures as increasingly sophisticated wisdom. Look deeply at your own patterns of interpretation. How often do your current worries, past hurts, or persistent hopes cause you to misread situations completely? Perhaps someone's distracted behavior becomes evidence they don't like you when they're actually concerned about a family member's health. Maybe a colleague's helpful suggestion feels like criticism because you're insecure about your performance. This ancient wisdom illuminates how our internal state creates our external experience. Both monks were sincere in their perceptions, yet both were fundamentally mistaken about what was actually happening. Neither was lying or deliberately misinterpreting. They were simply seeing through the lens of their own psychological conditioning. The story points us toward a crucial question. How can we develop the capacity to see situations more clearly, less filtered through our personal concerns and interpretations? Zen practice offers several approaches to this challenge. First is what's called don't know mind. Maintaining openness to multiple interpretations, rather than immediately settling on the one that confirms our existing beliefs or fears. When someone acts in a way that triggers our interpretation, can we pause and consider other possible explanations? Second is mindfulness of our own emotional states. The attendant might have noticed his rising sensitivity about his appearance and recognized how this was coloring his perception. The traveler might have observed his eagerness to find profound teachings and questioned whether he was seeing wisdom where none existed. Zen Master Bankei taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." This teaching invites us to examine the very mind that creates these interpretations, rather than constantly trying to figure out the correct interpretation of external events. The Buddha said, "Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal." If the attendant had met the traveler's perceived insults with curiosity rather than defensiveness, if the traveler had questioned his assumptions about enlightened behavior, their encounter might have become a genuine teaching for both. Tonight, as you replay conversations and interactions from your day, can you notice how your own concerns and sensitivities might have shaped your interpretations? Can you sense the difference between what actually happened and the meaning your mind added to those events? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. By understanding how our internal weather creates our external storms, we discover the possibility of clear seeing that serves both wisdom and compassion. Let us keep going on our journey. The following story reveals the difference between helping and holding on. This is the lesson of the two monks and the woman at the river. Two monks were traveling together along a mountain path, making their way to a distant monastery where they planned to continue their studies. Both were dedicated practitioners who had taken strict vows as part of their spiritual training, including a vow to avoid all physical contact with women. This wasn't born from disrespect, but from their understanding that such discipline helped maintain focus on their spiritual development. As they approached a swollen river where the usual bridge had been damaged by recent storms, they encountered a young woman standing uncertainly at the water's edge. The current was strong and treacherous, filled with debris from the mountain runoff, and she was clearly afraid to attempt crossing alone. "Please, honored monks," she called to them, Could one of you help me cross this dangerous water? I'm not strong enough to make it safely on my own." One of the monks immediately tensed, his mind racing through their monastic rules and the potential complications of this situation. Physical contact with women was explicitly forbidden, and he began formulating explanations for why they couldn't help, perhaps suggestions for alternative solutions that wouldn't require breaking their vows. The other monk, however, took one look at the woman's predicament and the genuine danger she faced and made a different choice. Without hesitation or lengthy deliberation, he walked to her side and gently lifted her onto his shoulders. He carried her carefully across the treacherous current, ensuring her safety with each step, and set her down gently on the far bank. "Thank you so much," she said gratefully, bowing to both monks before continuing on her way. The two monks resumed their journey, but the atmosphere between them had changed dramatically. The first monk walked in increasingly agitated silence, his mind churning with thoughts about what he had witnessed. As the hours passed, his internal tension grew until finally he could no longer contain his distress. "Brother," he burst out, unable to hold his silence any longer, "I cannot understand your behavior back at the river. Our spiritual training explicitly teaches us to avoid any physical contact with women. Yet you picked that woman up onto your shoulders and carried her across the water. How could you so blatantly violate our sacred vows?" His companion looked at him with gentle surprise and responded with perfect simplicity. "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river hours ago, but you are still carrying her." Buddha's wisdom teaches us, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This tale unveils the profound difference between compassionate action and mental attachment, between responding to present needs and carrying past events. Why do we often carry situations long after they've ended, replaying scenarios and nursing grievances that only exist in our own minds? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our inability to release experiences once they've passed. The first monk's agitation demonstrates how rigid adherence to rules can sometimes conflict with the compassionate spirit that inspired those rules originally. His fellow monk saw a person in danger and responded with immediate kindness, then completely released the incident. But the first monk carried the event for hours, letting it grow heavier with each step. Consider your own tendency to replay past conversations, nurse old grievances, or mentally rehearse scenarios that have already ended. How much of your mental energy goes toward carrying situations that exist now only in memory? The woman crossed the river in minutes, but the monk carried her for hours through his own thoughts. This teaching applies to far more than dramatic violations of rules. We carry harsh words someone spoke years ago, mistakes we made decades past, embarrassing moments that no one else even remembers. Meanwhile, the present moment, rich with possibility and actual experience, goes unnoticed because we're too busy carrying ghosts from the past. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between appropriate action and unnecessary attachment. The second monk helped when help was needed, then moved on completely. He didn't dwell on whether he'd made the right choice, worry about others' opinions, or replay the incident endlessly in his mind. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. The river crossing was impermanent. It began, served its purpose, and ended. Only the first monk's attachment to the event gave it ongoing existence in the form of mental suffering. The Buddha said, "Let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax, right now, and rest. This teaching points directly to the freedom available when we stop carrying experiences beyond their natural lifespan. Look deeply at what you might be carrying unnecessarily. Old resentments, past failures, conversations that upset you, decisions you regret. All of these exist now only because you continue to pick them up and carry them. What would it feel like to set them down? The irony is profound. The monk who actually broke the rule experienced no suffering from it, while the monk who maintained perfect rule observance created hours of agitation for himself. This reveals that suffering often comes not from our actions, but from our thoughts about our actions. Tonight, as you notice your mind returning to past events, old grievances, or situations that have already ended, can you remember the wise monk's example? Can you practice setting down whatever you've been carrying unnecessarily, discovering the lightness that comes from traveling through life without the burden of yesterday's experiences? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, only three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. True spiritual practice isn't about perfect rule following, but about responding appropriately to what's actually present, then releasing it completely to make space for whatever comes next. Now, let us explore a story about the difference between superficial understanding and lived wisdom. This is the tale of following the stream. In the heart of a vast wilderness, where towering pines stretched toward endless sky, two city dwellers found themselves completely lost. They had ventured into the high timber for what was supposed to be a simple day hike, but overconfidence and poor preparation had led them far from any familiar trail. For a day and a night, they wandered through the dense forest, their anxiety growing with each passing hour. The comfortable urban world they knew seemed impossibly distant. Every tree looked the same. Every path led to another confusing intersection, and their sense of direction had completely abandoned them. Just as panic was beginning to set in, they stumbled upon an old hermit sitting peacefully beside a small clearing. His weathered face spoke of years spent in solitude, and his calm presence offered immediate comfort to the desperate travelers. "How do we find our way back to civilization?" they asked urgently, their voices carrying the desperation of people who had exhausted their own resources. The hermit looked at them with kind eyes that seemed to see more than their immediate predicament. "I could tell you," he replied thoughtfully, "but you'd still get lost." The two men exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the straightforward directions they had hoped for. "What should we do?" they asked, their frustration evident. "Go with the flow," the hermit answered simply. "I beg your pardon," one of them responded, clearly expecting something more practical and specific. The hermit smiled and gestured toward a small stream that bubbled cheerfully through the clearing. "Go with the flow. You see that stream over there? Just follow it. Streams go into creeks, and creeks go into rivers, and rivers go through towns. Also, along the way you'll have water to drink and berries to eat." This practical advice made immediate sense to the lost travelers. Following water downstream was indeed a reliable way to find human settlements, and the stream would provide essential resources they needed for survival during their journey. But one of the men, perhaps having heard spiritual teachings before, asked a deeper question. "Is that what Zen people mean when they say, 'go with the flow'?" The hermit paused for a moment, considering this question with the same careful attention he had given their practical need for directions. "Yes and no," he replied enigmatically, and then continued along his way. leaving the two men to find their own understanding of his words. The Buddha once said, "If you understand, things are just as they are. If you do not understand, things are just as they are." This teaching points to the layered nature of wisdom that the hermit embodied in his response to the lost travelers. The deeper teaching here shows us how authentic spiritual guidance operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The hermit's advice was both completely practical and profoundly metaphorical. On the surface level, following the stream was simply good wilderness survival strategy. On a deeper level, it represented the entire approach to living that Zen encourages. Why did the hermit say the travelers would still get lost, even if he gave them directions? This points to a fundamental truth about the difference between receiving information and developing wisdom. External directions can guide us temporarily, but they don't develop our inner capacity for navigation. Real wisdom involves learning to read the natural signs and flow with the underlying currents of life itself. Consider how this applies to our spiritual seeking. We often approach teachers and teachings looking for specific directions. Tell me exactly what to do to become enlightened. Give me the precise meditation technique that will solve my problems. But this approach, while understandable, misses the deeper point. True spiritual guidance doesn't provide a map, but teaches us how to read the territory. It doesn't give us someone else's answers, but helps us develop the capacity to find our own. Like the stream that naturally knows its way to the ocean, we each have an innate wisdom that can guide us if we learn to trust and follow it. The phrase "go with the flow" has become so common in popular culture that it's almost lost its meaning, often interpreted as passive resignation or lack of direction. But the hermit's yes and no response points to a more nuanced understanding. True flowing isn't about drifting aimlessly, but about aligning our efforts with the natural currents of wisdom and compassion. The stream represents the Tao, the natural way that underlies all existence. When we align ourselves with this deeper flow, our actions become effortless and effective. We stop pushing against reality and learn to work with the grain of existence rather than against it. But this requires developing a different kind of intelligence than our usual problem-solving mind. The travelers wanted explicit directions because that's how the rational mind works, through clear, step-by-step instructions. But the deeper intelligence the hermit was pointing toward operates more like intuition, sensing the right direction moment by moment rather than following a predetermined plan. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize present moment awareness. The stream doesn't need to know where the ocean is. It simply flows in the direction that feels natural right now. Similarly, when we develop moment-to-moment mindfulness, we can sense the appropriate response to each situation without needing to figure out the entire journey in advance. Tonight, as you navigate the complexities of your own life, can you sense the streams of natural wisdom flowing beneath the surface of your daily concerns? What would it mean to trust that deeper current while still attending responsibly to practical necessities? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. The hermit's guidance was like lighting a candle in the travelers' minds, providing not just directions, but a way of approaching life that could serve them in countless future situations. Let us continue our journey with a story about the transformative power of fearlessness and unconditional compassion. This is the tale of the thief and the Zen master. One quiet evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zen master Shichiri Kojun sat in his simple home, reciting ancient sutras. His voice flowed rhythmically through the peaceful rooms, each word a meditation, each breath a prayer. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as he immersed himself completely in the sacred texts, finding deep tranquility in the familiar verses. Suddenly, the serenity was shattered. The front door burst open with a violent crash, and a desperate man entered, brandishing a sharp sword that gleamed menacingly in the candlelight. His eyes were wild with desperation, his clothes dirty and torn, his breathing heavy from running. He had clearly chosen this isolated house because he believed it would be an easy target. A peaceful monk would offer no resistance. "Money or your life?" the thief demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and aggression. He expected the old man to cower, to plead, to scramble frantically for whatever valuables he might have hidden away. But Shichiri didn't even look up from his sutra book. His voice remained calm and steady as he continued reciting for a moment before pausing to address the intruder. "Please don't disturb my practice," he said, with the same gentle tone he might use to ask someone to close a door. "If you need money, help yourself. It's in that drawer over there." He gestured casually toward a simple wooden chest, then immediately returned to his recitation as if nothing unusual had occurred. The thief stood frozen, his sword still raised, completely bewildered. In all his years of stealing, he had never encountered such a reaction. No fear, no pleading, no anger, just matter-of-fact helpfulness, as if he were a neighbor who had stopped by to borrow something. Shaking his head in confusion, but proceeding with his business, the thief moved to the indicated drawer and began gathering the coins and small valuables he found there. The soft sound of the master's voice continued behind him, reciting sacred words as peacefully as if he were alone. Just as the thief was preparing to leave with his stolen goods, the master's voice called out again. "Wait," Shichiri said, finally looking up from his book. "Please don't take everything. I need some of that money to pay my taxes tomorrow. Leave a little for me, won't you?" The thief stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who was being robbed, calmly negotiating the terms of his own robbery, as if they were conducting normal business. Almost without thinking, the thief returned some of the money to the drawer. As he turned to leave, certain that this strange encounter was finally over, the master's voice stopped him once more. "You took my money," Shichiri called out, his tone carrying a note of reproach. "And you didn't even thank me. That's quite rude, don't you think?" This final comment left the thief completely speechless. His sword hand began to shake. Never in his most violent encounters had he been so thoroughly unnerved. Here was a man who treated robbery as if it were a favor, who was more concerned about politeness than personal safety. Thank you," the thief stammered, and then fled into the night as quickly as his legs would carry him. Later, when the thief was caught and confessed to numerous crimes, including the incident at Shichiri's house, the master was called as a witness. The court officials expected him to demand justice, to describe the terror and violation he had experienced. Instead, Shichiri spoke with the same calm clarity he had shown that evening. "This man did not steal anything from me," he testified. "I gave him the money freely. He even thanked me for it, though it took a little reminding." The thief, sitting in chains, felt something break open in his chest as he heard these words. This man had not only shown him extraordinary kindness in the moment of the crime, but was now protecting him from the consequences. For the first time in years, tears came to his eyes. Not tears of self-pity or anger, but tears of recognition. He had encountered something he had never experienced before: love without conditions. Upon his release from prison, the former thief sought out the master and begged to become his student. Under Shichiri's patient guidance, he learned to cultivate the same fearless compassion he had witnessed that night. Years later, through dedicated practice and the master's unwavering belief in his potential for transformation, he attained the deep peace and wisdom of enlightenment. As the Buddha observed, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What emerges from this story is the revolutionary power of meeting violence with absolute peace, responding to taking with giving, and answering fear with love. Why do we instinctively believe that force must be met with force, that aggression requires defensive reaction? Zen Buddhism reveals that this pattern, while natural, often perpetuates the very conflicts it seeks to resolve. When we respond to hostility with hostility, we simply escalate the cycle of suffering. But when we respond with genuine compassion, not passive submission, but active love, we create space for transformation that wouldn't otherwise exist. Look deeply at your own experience. When someone approaches you with anger, criticism, or demand, what is your automatic response? Most of us immediately mobilize our defenses, preparing to protect ourselves through counterattack or withdrawal. But notice what happens in your body and mind during these defensive reactions. Does the tension decrease or increase? Does the conflict resolve or intensify? Shichiri's response demonstrates what Zen calls skillful means, acting from wisdom rather than reflex. His fearlessness didn't come from being unaware of danger, but from understanding something profound about the nature of reality. He recognized that the thief's aggression arose from desperation and suffering, not from inherent evil. By refusing to see him as an enemy, Shichiri created the possibility for the thief to see himself differently. In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called the courage of defenselessness. This doesn't mean being naive about genuine danger or allowing ourselves to be harmed unnecessarily. Rather, it means developing the confidence to respond to difficult situations from our highest wisdom, rather than our most primitive instincts. The Buddha taught, in the end, just 3 things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Shichiri embodied all 3 in his encounter with the thief. He lived from complete presence, loved without conditions, and let go of any attachment to his possessions or even his personal safety. Consider the people in your life who challenge you: the difficult colleague, the critical family member, the aggressive driver in traffic. What would it mean to meet their energy with the same kind of fearless compassion Shichiri showed? Not by agreeing with them or submitting to their demands, but by refusing to match their level of reactivity, by staying connected to your own center of peace, regardless of their behavior. Tonight, as you encounter your own moments of tension or conflict, can you remember the master who treated a robber as an honored guest? Can you find the space between stimulus and response where choice lives, where you can decide to meet aggression with peace, taking with giving, fear with love? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence is simply to remain unshakable in our commitment to compassion, knowing that love has a transformative power that force can never match. Our next story reveals the power of returning to what is real when fear threatens to overwhelm us. This is the tale of the captured warrior. In ancient Japan, during a time of constant warfare between rival clans, a skilled warrior found himself on the losing side of a fierce battle. As his comrades fell around him and defeat became inevitable, he was captured by enemy soldiers and dragged away from the battlefield, his armor stripped, his weapons confiscated. That evening, they threw him into a dark, cramped prison cell with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through his bones. As darkness settled over the prison, the warrior's mind began to race with terrifying possibilities. Tomorrow, they would come for him. He knew the customs of war. First would come the interrogation, designed to extract information about his lord's defenses, troop movements, and strategic plans. When he refused to speak, as honor demanded, they would resort to torture. Hot iron, bamboo splinters under his fingernails, methods he had heard described in hushed tones by other warriors. And when they had extracted what they could, or when they grew tired of his silence, would come the execution. As these thoughts consumed him, his heart began to pound so violently he feared it might burst. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Sleep seemed impossible as his mind conjured increasingly vivid scenarios of tomorrow's suffering. Hours passed in this torment. The warrior paced his small cell, sat against the cold stone wall, lay on the straw-covered floor. Nothing brought relief from the visions of impending doom that played repeatedly in his mind like a terrible dream he couldn't escape. Then, in the depths of his despair, he remembered the gentle voice of his Zen master back at the monastery where he had studied before becoming a warrior. The old teacher's words came to him as clearly as if the master were sitting beside him in the cell. Tomorrow is not real. It is an illusion. The only reality is now. At first, the warrior's frightened mind resisted these words. How could tomorrow be an illusion when the threats were so concrete, so inevitable? But as he sat quietly and allowed the teaching to penetrate deeper, something began to shift. He noticed his breathing. In this moment, he was breathing freely. He felt the straw beneath him, rough, but not uncomfortable. He heard the sound of wind moving through the trees outside his window, a sound that spoke of the natural world, continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of human conflict. In this moment, he was not being tortured. In this moment, he was not dying. In this moment, there was simply a man sitting in a cell, alive and aware. The terrors that had seemed so overwhelming moments before revealed themselves to be nothing more than thoughts about a future that existed only in his imagination. As this understanding deepened, a profound peace settled over the warrior. His breathing slowed and deepened. His racing heart found a steady rhythm. For the first time since his capture, he smiled. The master's wisdom had freed him from a prison far more confining than the stone walls around him, the prison of anxious thoughts about tomorrow. Within minutes, the warrior fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound truth the warrior discovered in his cell. The only moment in which we ever actually live is this one. Why do we torture ourselves with endless scenarios about the future? Zen Buddhism explains that our minds evolved as survival mechanisms, constantly scanning for threats and planning for protection. While this capacity serves us in genuine emergencies, it becomes a source of suffering when we mistake mental projections for reality. Look deeply at your own experience. How much of your anxiety stems from vivid imaginings of future scenarios that may never occur? The presentation you're worried about, the medical test results you're awaiting, the difficult conversation you need to have. These situations exist primarily in thought, not in present reality. The warrior's teaching shows us that we can acknowledge future challenges without being consumed by them. Planning and preparation have their place, but when they transform into obsessive worry, they rob us of peace and clarity. As Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. The future remains unwritten, shaped by causes and conditions we cannot fully predict or control. The worried mind assumes that current difficulties will inevitably continue or worsen, but impermanence teaches us that everything changes. The warrior in his cell could not know what the next day would actually bring. Perhaps his lord's forces would mount a rescue. Perhaps his captors would show mercy. Perhaps diplomatic negotiations would secure his release. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "The past is gone, the future is not yet here, and there is only one moment for you to live." This teaching doesn't encourage us to ignore future responsibilities or avoid reasonable planning. Instead, it invites us to recognize where our attention habitually goes and to gently guide it back to the richness of present experience. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with fresh awareness rather than predetermined anxiety. When we truly inhabit the present, we often discover that it contains resources for peace and clarity that worried thinking never revealed. Consider how the warrior's shift in attention transformed his entire experience. The same cell, the same uncertain future, but by returning to present moment awareness, suffering transformed into peace. This transformation is available to us in every moment of anxiety or fear. Tonight, as you notice your mind creating stories about tomorrow's challenges, remember the captured warrior and his master's wisdom. What is actually happening right now? What simple experiences, breathing, sitting, the temperature of the air, are available to anchor you in reality rather than imagination? As the Buddha taught, do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment. In this teaching lies the key to the warrior's prison and our own. Let us now turn to a story about the nature of identity and the mystery of consciousness itself. This is the tale of Chuang Tzu and the butterfly. The ancient Taoist sage Chuang Tzu lived simply, spending his days in quiet contemplation of the natural world and the deeper mysteries of existence. He was known for his profound insights into the nature of reality and his ability to see beyond the surface appearances that convince most people they understand the world around them. One afternoon, after a morning of walking through bamboo groves and observing the play of light on water, Chuang Tzu lay down beneath a flowering tree to rest. The gentle warmth of the sun, the soft sound of wind through leaves, and the fragrance of spring blossoms created the perfect conditions for deep relaxation. As he settled into this peaceful state, his consciousness gradually shifted from ordinary waking awareness into the mysterious realm of dreams. In his dream, something extraordinary occurred. Chuang Tzu found himself transformed into a beautiful butterfly, his human form completely forgotten. He fluttered gracefully from flower to flower, his delicate wings catching the sunlight as he moved through a world of pure color and sensation. There was no memory of being a philosopher, no awareness of human concerns or intellectual pursuits. He was simply and completely a butterfly, experiencing the world through compound eyes, navigating by instinct, living entirely in the present moment of flight and discovery. The butterfly that was Chuang Tzu felt utterly free, unburdened by the heavy thoughts and complex worries that typically occupy human consciousness. There was only the joy of movement, the sweetness of nectar, the warm touch of sun on delicate wings. This wasn't a dream about being a butterfly while knowing he was really a man. It was the complete experience of butterfly existence, with no trace of human identity remaining. Then, as suddenly as the transformation had occurred, Chuang Tzu awakened. He found himself lying beneath the tree, the afternoon sun having moved across the sky during his sleep. His human body felt solid and familiar, his philosopher's mind immediately active with questions and observations. The vivid dream began to fade as waking consciousness reasserted itself. But instead of simply dismissing the experience as an unusual dream, Chuang Tzu found himself puzzled by a profound question that challenged everything he thought he knew about identity and reality. He sat up slowly, still feeling the lingering sensation of flight, and pondered the implications of what had just occurred. Was I just now a man dreaming I was a butterfly? He wondered aloud. Or am I perhaps a butterfly now dreaming that I am a man? The question wasn't merely playful speculation. It pointed to something fundamental about the nature of consciousness and identity that most people never consider. If the experience of being a butterfly had felt completely real and authentic while it was happening, how could he be certain that his current experience of being human was any more real or permanent? Buddha's wisdom teaches us, all conditioned existence is impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. This ancient teaching illuminates the fluid nature of identity and the importance of not clinging too tightly to any particular sense of self. Why do we assume that our current state of consciousness represents the ultimate reality? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to take our present experience as fixed and absolute, when in fact, all states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, sleeping, are temporary and constantly changing phenomena arising in the vast space of awareness. Chuang Tzu's question challenges our basic assumptions about who and what we are. During the dream, the butterfly identity felt completely authentic and real. Upon waking, the human identity seems equally authentic and real. But which one represents his true nature? Or is perhaps the question itself based on a false premise? Consider your own experience of identity throughout different states of consciousness. Are you the same you when you're dreaming as when you're awake? What about when you're deeply absorbed in an activity, or in deep meditation, or in moments of creative flow when self-consciousness disappears entirely? Which of these states represents your real identity? In Zen practice, we explore the possibility that all these different identities are simply temporary appearances in consciousness, like waves on the ocean or clouds in the sky. The waves are real, but they're not separate from the ocean. The clouds are real, but they're not separate from the sky. Similarly, all our various identities and experiences are real, but they're not separate from the underlying awareness in which they appear. The butterfly dream reveals something profound about the nature of transformation and possibility. If Chuang Tzu could completely become a butterfly in his dream consciousness, what does that suggest about the fixed boundaries we imagine exist around our identity? How solid are the limitations we place on ourselves based on our current circumstances or self-concept? Zen Master Dogen taught, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self." Chuang Tzu's experience points to this same teaching. The more deeply we investigate the nature of selfhood, the more we discover that our fixed ideas about identity begin to dissolve. The Buddha said, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." The man and the butterfly are both real and both empty of permanent, independent existence. They are temporary formations in the field of consciousness, each authentic while present, each naturally dissolving to make way for whatever comes next. Look deeply at your own sense of identity. How much of who you think you are is based on roles, memories, and concepts that are actually quite fluid and changeable? What would remain if you let go of your attachment to being any particular type of person? Tonight, as you move between waking consciousness and the dream state, can you remember Chuang Tzu's profound question? Can you hold your identity lightly, recognizing that whether you're experiencing yourself as human or butterfly, worker or dreamer, the awareness in which all these experiences arise remains constant and unbound? As the Buddha observed, everything is impermanent. Strive on with awareness. The man dreams of being a butterfly. The butterfly dreams of being a man. But the dreaming itself, the pure capacity for experience, remains as vast and free as the sky, untouched by whatever temporary forms dance within it. Let us continue on our journey with a story about the intensity required for genuine spiritual awakening. This is the tale of the drowning lesson. Beside a crystal clear mountain river, where water flowed over smooth stones with the endless song of moving current, a hermit had established his practice. For years, he had lived in solitude, finding in the rhythm of flowing water and changing seasons a perfect mirror for the movements of his own consciousness. One morning, as golden sunlight filtered through the canopy and the air carried the fresh scent of mountain laurel, a young man approached the hermit's simple dwelling. The seeker had traveled far, his clothing dusty from the journey, his face earnest with spiritual longing. "Master," the young man said, bowing respectfully, "I wish to become your disciple." The hermit looked up from his contemplation, studying the newcomer with eyes that had grown accustomed to reading the subtle signs of genuine versus superficial spiritual interest. "Why?" the hermit replied simply. The young man paused, considering his answer carefully. "Because I want to find God," he said finally, believing this to be the most noble response. What happened next took the seeker completely by surprise. Without warning, the hermit sprang to his feet, grabbed the young man by the scruff of his neck, and dragged him toward the river. Before the stunned visitor could protest, he found himself being pushed into the clear, cold water. The hermit's strong hands forced the young man's head beneath the surface and held him there. Panic set in immediately. The seeker's lungs began to burn as his oxygen depleted. He kicked and struggled with increasing desperation, his arms flailing as he fought to break free. Every second felt like an eternity as his body screamed for air. Nothing existed except the urgent, overwhelming need to breathe. After what seemed like a lifetime but was probably only a minute, the hermit finally pulled the gasping young man up out of the water. The seeker coughed violently, water streaming from his nose and mouth as he struggled to fill his lungs with precious air. His entire body shook from cold, shock, and the aftermath of near drowning. When his breathing finally normalized, the hermit spoke again, his voice carrying a different quality, still gentle, but charged with unmistakable intensity. "Tell me," he said, watching the young man's face carefully, "what did you want most of all when you were underwater?" The answer came without hesitation, raw and honest. "Air." The hermit nodded slowly, satisfied that his lesson had found its mark. "Very well," he said. "Go home and come back to me when you want God as much as you just wanted air." Without another word, the hermit turned and walked back to his place of meditation, leaving the dripping, shaken young man to contemplate the profound teaching he had just received. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Yet this wisdom must be ignited by genuine spiritual fire, not merely intellectual interest. The hermit's dramatic teaching illuminates the difference between casual spiritual curiosity and the total commitment that authentic awakening requires. What emerges from this story is recognition that spiritual seeking demands the same intensity and urgency we naturally bring to physical survival. The young seeker thought he wanted God, but his desire was still within the realm of preference rather than necessity. He wanted spiritual awakening as an addition to life rather than as life itself. Why do we approach spiritual development with tentative commitment? First is our attachment to comfort and the familiar. Genuine transformation requires letting go of who we think we are, which the ego experiences as death. Second is our misunderstanding of what spiritual seeking entails. Popular culture presents awakening as a pleasant expansion, but traditional teachings describe it as a dismantling of illusion. Third is our tendency to compartmentalize spirituality as one area among others, rather than a complete reorientation of our relationship to existence. Consider how this plays out in contemporary seeking. We collect techniques like trophies, jumping from meditation retreats to healing workshops to consciousness conferences, accumulating experiences without allowing any single practice to fundamentally transform us. We want the insurance policy of spiritual development without paying the premium of total dedication. The drowning experience represents what mystics call the dark night of the soul, moments when our usual sources of identity and security are stripped away. In such moments, we discover what we truly value most deeply. This is the quality of desire that spiritual awakening requires. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck wrote, "Practice is not about achieving some special state. Practice is about being willing to die to who you think you are." The hermit's lesson brought the young seeker face to face with this death-like quality of authentic spiritual work. This intensity doesn't mean spiritual practice should be grim. Rather, it means bringing the same passionate engagement to inner development that we naturally bring to whatever we value most deeply. A musician practicing for Carnegie Hall, a scientist pursuing a breakthrough, all demonstrate the focused dedication that spiritual awakening requires. The river represents the flow of ordinary consciousness, where we spend most of our time skimming along the surface. Being pushed underwater symbolizes the necessity of going deeper into the unconscious patterns that actually govern our lives. This depth work requires the same survival level intensity the seeker experienced when deprived of air. Tonight, as you consider your own spiritual aspirations, can you honestly assess the quality of your desire? Is your seeking driven by curiosity and preference, or by necessity? What would it mean to want truth as much as you want your next breath? As the Buddha taught, the way is not in the sky, the way is in the heart. The path to awakening lies not in accumulating more spiritual experiences, but in bringing the totality of our being to whatever practice we choose. Now let us explore a story about the power of belief and the destiny we create through faith itself. This is the tale of the general and the coin that revealed truth. A Japanese general faced an impossible situation. His army was greatly outnumbered by enemy forces. The terrain favored his opponents, and by every conventional measure of military strategy, the coming battle should result in devastating defeat. Yet something deep within him remained convinced that victory was possible. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps it was desperate hope, but he felt certain that his cause was just, and his troops, though fewer in number, possessed a fighting spirit that could overcome the odds. The problem was his soldiers. They could count as well as he could, and they had eyes to see the massive force arrayed against them. Fear rippled through their ranks like a contagion. Doubt clouded their faces. Whispered conversations filled with pessimism spread through the camp, and the general could sense that their morale was crumbling before the battle had even begun. He knew that an army convinced of its own defeat would indeed be defeated, regardless of any other factors. Technical skill, superior weapons, even numerical advantage means nothing when soldiers have already surrendered in their hearts. But an army that truly believed in its victory could accomplish seemingly impossible things through the sheer force of that conviction. On the morning of the battle, as they marched toward their destiny, the general led his troops to a small religious shrine that stood beside the road. This was a place where countless warriors had stopped over the centuries to pray before facing uncertain fate. The general gathered his men around him and led them in earnest prayer, asking for divine blessing and protection in the coming fight. When the prayers were finished, the general reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple coin. He held it high so that every soldier could see it clearly. "My brothers," he called out, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks, "we have prayed, and now we will let heaven itself reveal our destiny. I will toss this coin into the air. If it lands heads, we are fated to win this battle. If it lands tails, we are destined to lose. Let us discover what the gods have decided for us." The soldiers pressed closer, their breathing shallow with anticipation. Everything seemed to depend on this single moment, this one flip of metals spinning through the morning air. The general tossed the coin high, and every eye followed its arc as it rose, hung suspended for an instant against the sky, then fell back, down to earth. The coin landed and lay still in the dust. It was heads. A cheer erupted from the troops that could probably be heard for miles. Soldiers who had been grim and fearful moments before now laughed with joy and embraced each other with renewed confidence. The gods had spoken. Victory was assured. Their cause was blessed by heaven itself. Filled with this divine confidence, the soldiers attacked their enemies with such fierce determination and coordinated power that they achieved exactly what the coin had predicted. Against all odds, they won a decisive victory, routing forces much larger than their own and securing a triumph that would be remembered for generations. After the battle, As the general walked among his celebrating troops, his lieutenant approached him with wonder in his eyes. "General," the lieutenant said, "what an incredible thing. The coin revealed our true destiny, just as you said it would. Surely no human power can change what heaven has decreed." "You are absolutely right," the general replied with a knowing smile. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the coin, holding it so his lieutenant could examine it closely. "No one can change destiny." The lieutenant looked at the coin and gasped. Both sides showed heads. The Buddha once said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything. What we think, we become." Here we discover the profound truth that destiny is not something that happens to us, but something we create through the power of our own beliefs and expectations. Why do we so readily assume that fate is beyond our influence, when our own minds play such a crucial role in shaping what unfolds? Zen Buddhism teaches that while we cannot control all external circumstances, we have tremendous power over the internal conditions that determine how we respond to whatever arises. The general understood something profound about human psychology and the nature of reality itself. He knew that his soldiers' belief in victory was more important than their numerical disadvantage. He recognized that confidence, determination, and fighting spirit could overcome superior numbers when those qualities were genuinely present. But here's the deeper teaching. The general didn't simply manipulate his troops through deception. He created the conditions that allowed their natural courage and strength to emerge. The soldiers possessed the ability to fight brilliantly all along. They simply needed to believe in themselves and their cause. Consider your own relationship with destiny and possibility. How often do you assume that outcomes are predetermined, that success or failure is beyond your influence? The general's two-headed coin represents the power we all possess to tip the scales in favor of positive outcomes through the quality of our engagement with life. This doesn't mean we can control everything through positive thinking, or that believing in something makes it automatically true. The soldiers still had to fight the battle. They still had to demonstrate actual skill and courage. But their belief in victory created the psychological conditions that allowed their best qualities to manifest. In Zen practice, we learn to work skillfully with both effort and surrender, both intention and acceptance. We recognize that while we cannot dictate specific outcomes, we can profoundly influence the energy and attention we bring to any situation. This quality of engagement often determines whether we experience success or failure, regardless of external circumstances. Zen Master Huang Po taught, "The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see." The general was wise enough to see that his soldiers' thoughts about the battle were more influential than their thoughts about their numerical disadvantage. He worked with the reality of psychology rather than fighting against it. Look deeply at the various challenges and opportunities in your own life. Where might you be carrying a tails mentality, assuming defeat before you fully engaged, focusing on obstacles rather than possibilities, letting fear determine your level of effort? And where might you need to create your own two-headed coin, a practice or perspective that consistently orients you toward positive engagement regardless of circumstances? The Buddha taught, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This isn't magical thinking, but recognition of the creative power of consciousness itself. When we approach situations with genuine confidence, clarity, and commitment, we often discover capabilities we didn't know we possessed. Tonight, As you consider the battles you're facing and the outcomes you're hoping for, can you find your own version of the general's wisdom? Can you create internal conditions that support your highest possibilities rather than your deepest fears? Can you recognize that while you cannot control destiny, you have profound influence over the beliefs and attitudes that shape how destiny unfolds through you? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The general's confidence lit the flame of belief in every soldier's heart. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is create the conditions that allow others and ourselves to discover the strength that was there all along. As we continue our journey, let us now turn to a story about acceptance and the art of contentment. This is the shepherd's wisdom. Along a dusty mountain road where wildflowers dotted the hillsides, a weary traveler encountered a shepherd tending his flock. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, and clouds gathered on the horizon, creating an uncertain sky that could promise either gentle rain or scorching heat. The shepherd sat peacefully on a smooth boulder, watching his sheep graze contentedly among wild grasses. His face bore the calm expression of one who had spent countless seasons under open sky, learning lessons that only nature can teach. There was something in his demeanor, a quality of unshakable serenity that drew the traveler's attention.
"Good morning, friend," the traveler called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "What kind of weather are we going to have today?"
The shepherd looked up with eyes that held mountain stream clarity and smiled with genuine warmth. "The kind of weather I like," he replied simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. The traveler paused, confused. He had expected a practical forecast that would help him plan his day. Instead, he received what seemed like circular logic, offering no useful information. "How do you know it will be the kind of weather you like?" the traveler pressed, his voice carrying frustration mixed with curiosity. The shepherd's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the vast sky above them, where clouds and clear patches moved in their eternal dance. "Having found out, sir, that I cannot always get what I like," he said, with the patience of one who had learned life's most essential lesson, "I have learned to always like what I get. So I am quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like." The traveler stood in silence, the profound simplicity of this wisdom settling into his understanding, like seeds finding fertile ground. Here was a man who had discovered something that all the weather predictions in the world could not provide: complete freedom from the anxiety of uncertainty. As the Buddha observed, attachment is the root of suffering. What emerges from this story is the recognition that true contentment comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from transforming our relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Why do we exhaust ourselves trying to arrange life according to our preferences, rather than learning to find peace within whatever life presents? The shepherd represents what Zen calls great acceptance, not passive resignation, but the profound wisdom that recognizes resistance to reality as the primary source of suffering. When we fight against what is, we create an internal war that drains our energy and blocks our capacity for contentment. When we learn to align ourselves with reality as it unfolds, we discover the tremendous peace that comes from swimming with the current rather than against it. Consider how much mental and emotional energy we spend each day resisting circumstances beyond our control. Traffic jams, weather that doesn't match our plans, people who don't behave as we think they should. Each resistance creates a small contraction in our awareness, a tiny rebellion against reality that accumulates into chronic dissatisfaction. The shepherd's approach doesn't mean becoming passive or ceasing to have preferences. We can still hope for sunny days while fully accepting rainy ones. We can work toward goals while finding peace when outcomes differ from expectations. The key lies in holding our preferences lightly rather than allowing them to determine our contentment. Zen master Seng Tsan wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." This doesn't suggest eliminating all desires, but rather not allowing those desires to become demands that reality must fulfill for us to be okay. Look deeply at your own patterns of resistance. How often do you find yourself arguing with reality, wishing circumstances were different, or believing you'll be content when things change? This tension is optional, not because you should suppress your desires, but because you can learn to hold them more skillfully. The Buddha taught that attachment doesn't mean caring deeply about things. It means making our inner peace conditional on external circumstances, arranging themselves according to our specifications. The shepherd cares about his flock and appreciates comfort, but his fundamental contentment doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, both pleasant and challenging, can you find the shepherd's secret within your own awareness? What if contentment isn't waiting for better circumstances, but is available right now through a shift in perspective? As the Buddha taught, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The shepherd discovered that when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations, we find the freedom to enjoy life exactly as it presents itself. Let us now turn to a tale of a young monk who believed he had failed in his spiritual journey. This is the story of the Golden Wake. At a peaceful monastery overlooking a serene mountain lake, a young student sat dejected on the temple steps as the sun began its descent toward the water. His shoulders sagged with the weight of disappointment, and his eyes reflected the heaviness in his heart. For months, he had struggled with his studies, unable to grasp the profound teachings that seemed to come so naturally to his fellow monks. "The boat is coming to take me home because I have failed in my studies here at the monastery," he said to his teacher, who had quietly approached and sat beside him. "What can I say to my family? They sent me here with such hope, believing I would return as a learned monk who could guide others on the path." The old teacher gazed out at the lake, where a small wooden boat was making its way slowly across the still water. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "Say that you did your best, and that is as much as anyone can do," he answered gently, his voice carrying the wisdom of many years. "But I wanted to be a famous monk and teach others," the boy replied, his voice thick with disappointment. "I dreamed of leading meditation sessions, of having students seek my guidance, of making a real difference in the world." "You can," the teacher said simply. "How?" asked the sad boy, looking at his teacher with confusion. "I couldn't even memorize the basic sutras. I fell asleep during meditation. I failed at everything that matters." The teacher smiled and pointed toward the water. "Live from your heart. I will show you. Do you see that boat making its way across the lake with the sun setting behind it?" "Yes," the boy replied, following his teacher's gaze. "Do you see its wake spreading across the lake? See how the boat looks like the apex of a golden triangle as the wake fans out from its bow?" The boy squinted, trying to see what his teacher described. "Sort of." "Squint," said the teacher patiently. That boat is you as you leave the monastery. The lake is your life. The wake is the effect that you will have on the world. Each ripple triggers another ripple, which triggers another. By constantly striving to live as wise and loving a life as you can teach the path of love to everyone you meet simply by being yourself. A few of these people will pass on your good example to others. Thus, the expanding golden wake of good works begets other good works. Most important, notice how each ripple catches the sun and bounces its light back to heaven. The boy watched in wonder as the simple boat continued its journey, the wake indeed forming an ever-widening triangle of light upon the water. Each small wave caught the golden sunlight and reflected it back toward the sky in countless sparkling points. "Would you come home with me and explain all of this to my father?" asked the boy, hope beginning to kindle in his voice. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. The deeper teaching here shows us that influence spreads not through grand gestures or perfect knowledge, but through the simple authenticity of a heart committed to goodness. Why do we believe that only formal credentials or recognized achievements qualify us to make a meaningful impact? Zen Buddhism points to our attachment to external validation and our misunderstanding of how wisdom actually transmits from person to person. We imagine that teaching requires a podium, a title, or a certificate, when in reality, the most profound lessons are shared through the quality of our presence and the integrity of our actions. Consider how often throughout your day you encounter people who touch your life not through their expertise, but through their kindness, their patience, or their simple human warmth. The grocery store clerk who greets you with genuine care, the stranger who offers directions with a smile, the friend who listens without judgment. These people create ripples that extend far beyond their awareness. In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called unconscious teaching. This is the natural transmission that occurs when we align our actions with our deepest values. Like the boat on the lake, we may not see our wake, but it spreads inevitably behind us, touching shores we never knew existed. The Buddha said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened." Happiness never decreases by being shared. Each moment of authentic living becomes a teaching. Each act of compassion creates ripples. Each choice to respond with wisdom rather than reactivity sends light back toward heaven. Tonight, as you reflect on your own journey, can you see the golden wake you're already creating? Perhaps it's in the patience you show a difficult family member, the encouragement you offer a struggling colleague, or the simple presence you bring to everyday encounters. The light you reflect may be illuminating paths you've never imagined. Tonight, as we come to the end of our time together, can you feel how the calm you've found isn't something far away that you need to search for, but something that's been inside you all along? Can you sense that the peace you've touched through these stories was always there, just waiting for you to notice it? The Buddha taught us, if you are facing in the right direction, all you need to do is keep walking. As you sit with this wisdom, remember that feeling peaceful and clear doesn't require perfect circumstances or special moments, but grows naturally from your own ability to be present, available whenever you choose to look inward. Each story we've shared tonight has shown a different side of the same simple truth, that our problems get smaller when we learn to hold life more gently, that real freedom comes when we stop fighting reality, and that lasting happiness comes from seeing through the thoughts that create unnecessary stress. Even when your mind wanders, even when old worries or restless feelings try to creep back in, the understanding you've gained tonight has settled deep inside you, ready to help and steady you whenever you need it most. Notice as you rest here now that these old teachings haven't pointed you towards some distant place, but toward a way of living with more ease and awareness right where you are. In the quiet that surrounds you, feel how your breathing has naturally slowed down, how your thoughts have settled, and how your whole body has relaxed into this peaceful state. As you move from this peaceful space back into your daily life, carry with you not just these stories, but the deep calm and insight they've stirred up in you. May this inner quiet stay with you, guiding you through whatever tomorrow brings. Thank you for joining us on this journey at Sleepy Monk. Sleep well